With the Cycle Frontier nearing its final days, I thought it would be a good time to reflect on how we got here, and more importantly, how we as players can learn from it. Let's get at it. Now I know what you might be asking. Why bother? Why rehash what was, and what does it matter to me? What impact can I make? Well, the fortunate thing about the timing is that there are a number of other Extract games coming out that are in early development. This means they are still in the stage where feedback will be more readily heard, theoretically. In order to do that, I will unfortunately have to talk about the things that caused the Cycle of Frontier's downward spiral. This hopefully will help other games from making the same mistakes and create enough good games within the space that allow us all to benefit from. Before we get started, I wanted to make a comment about everything I'm about to say. It's just my opinion. You got yours, and if we disagree, that's okay. At the very least, I hope to get you thinking and possibly start a dialogue. I also have the benefit of hindsight. It's easy to second guess decisions when you have time and the outcome to point to. I'll also be primarily focused on what happened prior to Season 3 of the Cycle Frontier, as I believe the outcome was well beyond the point of no return. The purpose of analyzing all of it, however, is to learn how not to repeat it, or in the case of player giving feedback, how to observe and give constructive feedback in the most effective way possible. The three main categories to learn from are the community, the devs, and hackers. I know that none of these are isolated from one another and often play off of each other. At the end of each section, I'll cover the main takeaways of that section, and at the end, I'll hopefully show how it all came together, or rather, how it all unraveled. Note though, the point isn't to lay blame on anyone other than those with a direct hand in what occurred. The first section we'll go over is the community, and that really depends on what time frame we're dealing with. The Cycle Frontier, when it was in its early testing phase, really only had two main competitors, Hunt Showdown and Tarkov. But it was clear based on the feedback going around that a big chunk of the player base was coming from Tarkov. A lot of the feedback was trying to push the game more and more in that direction, wanting to keep mixed-sized teams in the same lobby, removing the ability to ping, removing the ability to see friendlies through terrain, reducing the effectiveness of armor, pushing to eliminate or reduce matchmaking, and God forbid if you even suggest that there would be a rezzing in this game, you'd be downvoted into oblivion. I still remember a large content creator pushing for the removal of all friendly indicators as well. You get the idea. But an interesting thing happened. At some point around Season 1, either these players got what they wanted and stopped complaining, or just left. Because at some point, the community realized it kinda sucked grinding for armor that didn't do anything. Kinda sucked getting 3v1'd. It kinda sucked fighting people with 1,000 more hours in the game than you. So the feedback started to reverse itself. We eventually got a change in armor, we eventually got a change in matchmaking, we eventually got a change in locking the group sizes to the lobby, but we kept some of the other changes that were now made moot. We couldn't ping, and we couldn't see friendlies through terrain, even though the reasons for these changes were now gone. This became more extreme by the time we reached Season 3, when the wheels just fell off the community bus at this point. We got a change in movement, air accuracy, and armor, sort of. The game added inertia, which supposedly slowed the game down. I say supposedly because the biggest complainers could still insta-slide hop to infinity and kill in the air with impunity. A whole discussion about armor being nerfed got started and spun even though the numbers hadn't changed. Suddenly, what was deemed widely acceptable in Season 2 wasn't good enough in Season 3. Yeah, the cost upkeep was increased to the point of absurdity, but the protection hadn't changed. At that point, the appropriate feedback should have been centered around the disproportionate cost to effectiveness ratio, not the BS claims that the protection level had suddenly changed. These quote changes were being blasted on megaphones by a portion of a few content creators that were still around. Personally, I found it more than coincidental that this trend emerged during the time Jaeger's creator program was being absolutely mismanaged into the ground. Just saying. It was clear more and more feedback was geared to getting the cycle to go to the direction of Apex Legends for its movement, a clear departure from the feedback during its early development. Regardless of how you personally feel about these individual issues, it's pretty clear the community over time gave very mixed signals in terms of feedback, and honestly, who could blame them? Extract shooters are still new, but especially new when the cycle was first released. Most players are pulling from their experiences in games that only resemble the cycle in small ways. In all likelihood, the average player had changed, and so the feedback was going to change with it. But one thing remained the same. The feedback often sounded like the cycle should be more like this game that I played, that I'm not currently playing, and or hate for various reasons, end quote. No matter what side you're coming at this from, that sounds kinda backwards, doesn't it? So here's the main takeaway for this section. The game you are playing isn't the other game you played. They are different. Not only that, they need to be different. In a genre like extraction shooters where the number of potential players is going to be inherently more limited, each game has to be distinctly different from his competitors. The alternative is that it needs to be head and shoulders better, and even then, that might not be enough. For example, a company could make a Tarkov clone right now, make it better in multiple ways, but unless it has the massive budget to allow them to create large amounts of content and market it, Tarkov's critical mass of players wouldn't be largely affected in the long run. Look at Marauders for an example of trying to pull from the same player base of an established title within a genre. When comparing two games, try to understand what these two games you like have in common before you suggest having them be even more alike. Ask yourself, will these two games be so alike that I would no longer have a reason to play one of them? If the answer is yes, then ask, is that a good thing? And if you think so, for who? The second main takeaway is that features that don't cater to an experienced player, but are meant to make it easier for you to introduce your newer players to the game, should always be considered vital. Getting people I knew to try to play the cycle was incredibly hard, but it would have been way easier if we had pings, resing, and the ability to see each other through terrain. These are considered straight up quality of life features in most staple shooters. Potential players who are more likely to have a hard time starting off will need as much motivation as they can to stick through the initial learning process. The next section we will go over is the devs. We could go over all of the bugs and technical issues that persisted throughout the game's lifecycle, but I think the issues with Jaeger ran much deeper than that. In my opinion, Jaeger was poorly equipped to take on this kind of game, but that isn't 100% their fault. Most of it is, but not all of it. By the time development for the original cycle started, BRs were all of the rage. So one of the best ways for a dev team to secure funding for an upcoming game was to make it a BR, even though they were very much late to the party. But two main observations told me that a BR game wasn't Jaeger's first choice for making a game. The first observation was their world building was pretty extensive. Now there's nothing wrong with that. Jaeger did a really good job world building Fortuner's 3's story. But in a BR game, that's not really a big concern. At least not before you see financial success. Think of all of the successful BR games and consider how much depth their lore really has. It's pretty shallow by comparison, and that's because it doesn't need to be anything more than that. This tells me Jaeger was really passionate about storytelling and world building, but they left a lot to be desired in gameplay. They prioritized the wrong things. A trend we'll soon observe. Which brings me to my next observation. They didn't understand what draws people to BRs. The original cycle allowed you to drop in, do all sorts of activities for points, most of which weren't PvP oriented, could evac at the end, and you could win the match without even needing to be the last survivor. The whole setup showed that they misunderstood the basics of what a BR is and why people are drawn to it. The weapons and gear you will find are largely random, there's a mechanic that pushes players towards each other, and there's the last person standing. All things the cycle did not have. Having PvE elements wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but their ability to win you the match was weighted too heavily. You could more consistently win a match by min-maxing the mid-level PvE contracts than you could by straight up hunting for other players. By Season 3, they introduced the train to the map, which gave a lot more PvP opportunities, but by that point, it was too late to make any significant impact on the game's ability to survive, especially in an already saturated space like BRs. And this is before we even get to the Cycle Frontier, and you can start to see where this is already going. BRs were a well-established formula. While you do need to differentiate yourself from your competition, you should do so while not ignoring the key elements that make the genre appealing. The pivot to an extraction shooter was an obvious choice, and based on all of the announcements from other companies over the last year, they weren't the only ones thinking this. Without even getting into the hacker situation on release, because there's a whole section on that later, Jaeger once again found themselves making a game in a genre they clearly did not understand. To their credit, the game they made had all of the basic elements that made an extraction shooter enjoyable, but I think this was mostly by accident. I say that based on several decisions Jaeger made. The first big red flag is not having a reconnect feature on launch. It wasn't even thought of until the community beat them up over it. In a game where you lose your items upon death, how does a reconnect feature not become a must-have unless a room full of devs have absolutely no idea how this genre works? The second one is their matchmaking. They admitted to putting minimal attention to the importance of MMR because, and I quote, "We didn't think matchmaking would matter too much, as it doesn't for most extraction shooters," end quote. Anyone who's played any kind of PvP oriented game could have told them that, and by this point, most extraction shooters consisted of Hunt and Tarkov. Since Hunt had an excellent matchmaking system, we can see which one they were pulling from the most. And by, quote, realize quickly, they meant as of January 2023. By this point, the betas were well over a year and a half ago. Jaeger stubbornly held on to the loot extraction value as a main metric until enough of the community pressure forced him to finally give KD a, quote, try. The results were a night and day improvement. This change could have easily been addressed during one of the betas, but Jaeger stuck with the whole, quote, we wanted to encourage different playstyles, end quote, justification. In hindsight, we know now they wanted to promote or at least increase the viability of PvE oriented play. Given what we observed during the original cycle, this isn't surprising. The third reason is that they devoted untold amounts of money and time in creating a map that facilitated the worst type of gameplay any extraction shooter has. Anyone with any decent amount of hours in an extraction shooter could have told them this was a bad idea. I know. There were other extraction shooters that had environments like Theros Island, dark and close quarters. But not really. Not with the level of verticality it has, and not without any tools to prevent you from being ambushed. A scan grenade, a flare, a heartbeat sensor, literally anything that could have made it harder to ambush someone would have made this map significantly more bearable. But Jaeger failed to recognize this and misplaced a large amount of resources creating this map. And that's not the only thing Jaeger threw time and money at that didn't benefit the game in the long run. The fourth observation is the station. Now, I know many of you like the station. Let me ask you, how much time and energy do you think it took away from developing something that would have had more of a positive impact on the game? The only answer is too much. The station was introduced in Season 3 of the original cycle. A battle royale game doesn't need this, especially while it's not succeeding. None of the other extract shooters at this point had it either. This was modified and carried over to the Cycle Frontier, where it served much of the same purpose: nothing. Maybe if your group was in the same instance and could interact in some way, you could justify this. But as of the final update, this is still not a thing. During the lead up to Season 3, Jaeger even made a whole announcement about how they spruced it up, as if it mattered after months of radio silence and no new content. To me, this further demonstrated how ill-equipped they were for this game. A menu with different tabs would have been more than enough and would have cost significantly less resources to make and maintain. The last observation is the complete lack of an endgame. There were drills, there were oil pumps, and there were dungeons. But these activities didn't really offer you anything new. Effectively, they were just missions or jobs that had a higher risk of PvP for a higher payout. But by the time you got to them, you didn't need the payout, and if you wanted PvP, you could have just roamed the map pushing gunshots. So this just highlighted the lack of content available at the endgame, and created issues for the rest of the player base who were still progressing. There are a number of ideas people have come up with and suggested. The lowest resource intensive idea would have been a basic account reset with a prestige marker on your name, something of that nature. This would have been enough to at least slow this problem down. And this brings me to the takeaway. You can't help what the dev team is competent in, but you can focus your feedback on issues that have a bigger impact on the success of the game. With live game service models, it often becomes a dance of how much resources you can spend versus how much impact those resources have on the game's success. This is especially true with games with a more limited budget that are early on in their development. The second part of this takeaway is to learn to distinguish the difference between what's nice to have and what adds to the game's success. When you were learning to play the cycle, or still relatively new, which would you rather have, the station or a shooting range? The shooting range could have allowed you to try weapons, grenades, and even had dummies with different levels of armor where you can see just how quickly or not quickly the time to kill could be, or just how small the gap between armors were. After all, one of the consistent reasons for a negative Steam review were newer people running into higher geared players, but in reality, the difference between the armor was minimal to negligible depending on when they played. Devs need to focus their attention on developing features that actively increase and broaden their ability to acquire and retain new players. They also need to build in mechanisms to encourage late game achievements, but in both cases they need to weigh the possible features and potential benefits versus how much resources it will cost to implement. As a potential player, giving feedback needs to keep that in mind. Spending time giving suggestions for far-fetched ideas about mechanisms that need to be built from scratch that don't add or in some cases would supplant portions of the game is wasting your time and theirs. Focus on what's already there, what's fun, and what isn't. Give feedback based on that. If you're concerned about other factors, bring that up this way. What's next? Sure, it's fun for now, but do you have anything planned to keep me invested? Something like that. And at that point, maybe spitball something that might actually be possible, and that would take advantage of something that's already in the game. The last section is hackers, and it's a pretty short one. For those of you who are unaware, Cycle Frontier released in June 2022. It climbed to 40,000 concurrent players in its first week, which is crazy to think about considering it would struggle to break 5K for the remainder of its life. Shortly after its release, it saw an epidemic of hackers. The problem was made worse because large streamers that were playing the game would run into this problem consistently, speeding up the eventual problem. The cycle quickly became known for being infested with hackers. That amount of bad PR is almost impossible to overcome. You could say Jaeger failed to seriously consider the impact hackers would have on their game, and therefore they did not sufficiently prepare for it, so they are to blame. And you would be hard to argue against. However, consider that the cycle had already launched before, had already failed before. We can only speculate how much resources they had burned through during that time and the time developing the Cycle Frontier. They may very well have had to launch the game as it was or not at all. We will never know for sure. However, given the track record I outlined earlier, believing they lacked the understanding to make the proper decisions on this matter is a pretty reasonable position to hold. By Season 2, the hacker problem had been pretty much dealt with, but it was too late. I would be willing to bet that even if Jaeger made every decision in the best possible way after the first month of release, there's a strong possibility it would not have mattered. We could point to a specific or a series of decisions that Jaeger made that made the situation worse, but I sincerely believe the trajectory of the game was pretty much certain based on the way it was released. At best, it would have slowed it down, but not changed the final outcome. But this is the one and only takeaway as gamers we can have from this. The Cycle Frontier's corpse can be dangled in front of every prospective extract developer wanting to get their piece of the pie. It can serve as a reminder to not take this issue lightly because it will kill your game. And as players giving feedback, be sure to remind developers of this. And that's pretty much my take on what we can learn from the rise and fall of the Cycle and the Cycle Frontier. I am sure there are those of you that may disagree with me on some points, and I'd be happy to have that discussion. It's unfortunate, but the best thing we can do from this point is learn as much as we can and move on. For those of you still here, both my son and I really enjoy the Arc Raiders testing and are really looking forward to the next one whenever they announce it. There are good odds that I'll be making videos on that when the NDA is lifted. But in the meantime, is there something else you want to see? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and wherever you end up, good hunting.